Great.
Oh,
Thank you. That's great. That's very nice.
yeah, that's good. Cool.
Okay. All right. So I would say let us start, and I'm super happy to announce or to welcome our guest today, Cameran Ashraf. We are super excited to have him here. He's doing very exciting research on human rights and cybersecurity, and today he's going to present some of his research. And feel free also to ask questions about his work in real life politics or with real politicians. So he's assistant professor at the School of Public Policy here at CU. So he's reachable for you guys, and he holds a PhD in on geopolitics of internet censorship and cyber war from UCLA, from US. And at the same time, he check out his research. He has a few really nice publications on the impact of on cyber wars, violence in Pakistan's digital space, impact of AI on freedom of religion or belief on online. And I also have a list of other things that he's doing outside of research, and I'm just gonna go through them because they're super exciting. So he's at the same time also head of human rights at the Wikimedia Foundation, co-founder of international human rights and technology organization AccessNow, which in 2010 was awarded the Sakharov Prize for freedom of thought. Finalist for it, the European Union's highest human rights honor. And he's also was also an invited expert for the Kofi Annan Commission on Elections and Democracy in the Digital Era. He has numerous appearances in media, renowned media outlets like the New York Times, Wired Magazine, Bloomberg, Business Week, and he also has numerous guest talks at top universities like Harvard, MIT, and was also invited by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, so OSCE, and he also has advised International Criminal Court on digital security. And this is only a selection of the things that he has on his CV so far. So, Cameran, we're super happy to have you here. Thank you for accepting our invitation. We also have a few prospective students, faculty and PhD students today. So, without any further ado, I would like to give you the floor, and thank you again.
So thank you so much. Thanks for the invitation. It's nice to be here. Can everybody hear me okay? And I'm curious if there's any prospective students on Zoom. Maybe you can introduce yourself and maybe share a second or two about yourself and why you're here. I just always love to talk with prospective students. So if there's nobody there or you'd rather not share, it's totally fine. But I would love to hear if you're comfortable. I'll take that as a no.
No,
but
I can introduce myself. Sorry,
sure.
My camera doesn't. Okay. Yeah. Hello. My name is Anastasia. I'm the first year PhD student in political economy track, and yeah, I'm interested in the political economy of regime change and the patronage distribution and how it contributes to the stability. And my realm of interest is post-Soviet space in Russia specifically. And yeah, I'm very excited to hear your lecture.
Awesome. Thank you, Anastasia. Anyone else?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, my name is Milan Stankovic, and I am a first year prospectively first year MA student in political science, and my field of interest is populism, the consolidation of populism in Europe, and more specifically in European Union. And I'm glad to be here and to see your lecture. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Milan. Great. Well, I'm glad to meet both of you and everybody else who's online and in person. Thanks for having me here. Thank you for that very kind introduction. I always feel uncomfortable during those things. It's like, but I appreciate that. It's very nice of you. So I'm going to have a talk today about some challenges for artificial intelligence, and human rights. but taking a bit of a different angle than a lot of the dominant literature has focused on. I'm a professor here in public policy, so if you want to reach out here, absolutely no worries to connect with me. I'm also head of human rights at the Wikimedia Foundation, so I do both roles simultaneously, and I had a long experience in technology and human rights from 2009, so for quite some time. So I've seen the field really evolve and grow and change over the years. Anyway, so without any further ado, we can get started here. So first of all, I think one of the things we talk about AI is almost in this sort of like we tend to other AI, like it's out there, like it's something that's coming. You know what I'm talking about? Like we see these sci-fi movies where there's a lot of literature that's out there, or popular literature in the New York Times and Wall Street Journal and so on, talking about AI changing things. But AI is actually already ubiquitous. These people, none of these people here are actually real. These are all AI generated faces, right? Crazy, right? These are not real people. This is all completely AI generated faces. To give you an example of one level of where the state of AI currently is. Now, to take a quick aside with this, this kind of a program is used oftentimes by authoritarian regimes to generate, realistic looking people so that they can create fake profiles online in order to, target activists or to make them reveal information or to download malware or to create fake organizations that act as fronts for authoritarian activities online when chasing human rights defenders and democracy activists and so on. But anyway, quite remarkable when you look at this. There's lots of these faces online that you can see. In fact, there's developed by NVIDIA, the company that you might be very familiar with that develops graphics cards. But AI already is ubiquitous. It's already everywhere. It already manages automatically billions of dollars. There are major financial advisory firms that are completely AI driven. In fact, some of your pension funds might be already AI driven. It's kind of remarkable to think about it, like the future of your financial security is handled by an algorithm. AI already curates your playlist, like if you use Spotify or Apple Music or anything like that. It recommends books. And I've been an Amazon customer since 1999. Back when I was a teenager, I thought, oh, this is so cool, an internet bookstore. Well, of course, it will never replace the real bookstore, was my thinking. But I just did it for fun. But because I've ordered so many books over the years, Amazon's AI recommendation system is so incredibly precise with me. It's actually really enriched my life, even though I have very serious issues with AI. So I want to put that out there, that I'm not one of those AI ascetics here. AI helps us find what we need in search engines, right? When you type in a Google search, right? AI, the artificial intelligence there will take, your search history, the search history in your geographic region, which is something most people don't realize, and in your linguistic community to actually put the results that it believes are most relevant for you. So if you're coming from an academic research perspective, that actually is kind of problematic because you're actually not getting the results that would be you expect more objectively. You're getting something conditioned by the local environment in which you live. Okay, so that's a separate topic to talk about. Police around the world use AI to determine when and where to patrol. So something actually happens in Hungary, happens in Austria, happens in most Western countries, democracies, where police will input crime-based data so that the AI program can actually help them understand where should we patrol, what kind of individuals should we look out for, what time of the day should we be there, and so on. If you've ever seen police officers patrolling at a weird time of day in a neighborhood where you're like, why would they be here? It might have been an AI directed patrol. It might be in a wealthy neighborhood, for example. You might see weird police patrol at the same time because there might have been high value arrests, high value thefts in that neighborhood over years around that time. And so the AI is coming to go out and do that. Thousands of employers, including the government of Austria, actually use AI to determine who to hire and how much to pay them. Of course, you can understand, so you can already picture some of the human rights concerns right there, right off the bat, because these AI systems can be biased towards certain individuals who have certain names. There's a famous case in the United States where AI is used in hiring decisions, and it was something like if your name was like Kevin or Matthew in the United States, you had 7 times more likely to get a position than if not, and that was because the data that was used to inform the AI was based on successful applicants, employees who've been considered to be successful employees, and they happened to be named Kevin and Matthew. So then the AI started to look for people who had those names and to recommend them to be hired or recommend them to be interviewed. So this is actually already used here in Austria. One of former students of public policy did her master's thesis on actually discrimination in the AI hiring in Austria, which tends, and also in distributing public benefits, which tends to disproportionately target, take a guess, immigrants, right? Or people who have, for example, Islamic sounding names, like my name, I'm Habarani. The amount of times I've had random security checks all around the world is, it makes it look a little less random than it should be. That's another example right there. So AI is everywhere. It's already changed our life. When we talk about, how is AI going to change the world? We need to look historically now, because AI has been doing this for a long time. But I think we'll take a step back and we need to talk a little bit about what is AI, because it's super complex, right? And the word kind of lends itself to that kind of othering, like AI. You don't exactly know what it is, but it kind of feeds into sort of, preconceived collective or individual unconscious biases. So we'll talk a little bit about what it is. There's actually no definition of what AI is. So just to take it off the table right away, we actually have no idea what it is. Like many things, in reality, we actually have no accepted definition. There are lots of different competing sort of frameworks and ways to think about AI and ways to classify it. So we'll talk a little bit about that in terms of what does AI actually do. So these I've taken some various different definitions or aggregated various different definitions that are out there in the literature and in popular press. One thing that AI does is analyze inputs and generate outputs. That's a very simplistic way to look at it. It makes predictions based on patterns, observed patterns. It iteratively learns from errors. Microsoft has a really good definition that I like. It seeks to mimic human-like cognitive functions such as learning and problem solving. Okay, so this is, to give you an idea, we're going to go a little bit more into what it is, but if you want to think about AI as a very broad category, more conceptually, that's a useful way to think about it. So there are two, within AI, consider two broad areas under which various aspects of AI fall. Narrow AI is the one that we're all used to, right? The one that I was just talking about, that manages money, that sends you different recommendations for books, that curates your Facebook or Instagram feed, and so on. Narrow AI is composed of sort of three different aspects. The first is machine learning. And machine learning, essentially, what it is that the system with inputs that are given by a human being, it learns to do one task well over time, repeatedly, right? There's a couple different variants with that. A supervised data input is when you want to see, okay, what's the population of Vienna going to be in X years, or how many immigrants are we going to have in X years in Los Angeles? And that might be when you actually know what you want to get. But you may have a set of data, a set of information that you actually have no idea what you really want. That's more unsupervised. And you input that into the system, and then it identifies what it considers to be relevant or interesting data points for you that it's identified based on the parameters of how the algorithm's been designed. Machine learning, you can kind of think of it quite broadly, and that's just a really high-level overview. This is not an AI engineering talk. You can think of stuff like Instagram, right, where it curates your feed based on your likes and your interactions, but also your likes and interactions of people you follow, the people you interact with a lot, right? So it's quite a complex series of things that happen. So it's good at doing one thing, sending you pictures that it thinks are relevant for you. AlphaGo, the very famous AI that actually beat a human in the game of Go, right? Developed by Google, really, really important and significant. They basically fed it an initial data set at Google of famous Go matches, and then had it replay those matches and learn the mistakes and just go from there, and ended up beating the world Go champion. And when you actually read the interviews with the people who played against it, they said it played like an alien. It used Go moves that had never appeared in the history. And Go is a very ancient game, with like over 1,000 years, I think, of recorded actual games. And so they said it actually played like an alien with moves that had never been done in Go, and like strategies. It wasn't playing like the next 3 moves. It was playing like 40 moves down or something like that. So it's really quite remarkable, but that's a very easy example of machine learning. And also Deep Blue, which some of you who might be a little older might remember when Gary Kasparov lost to Deep Blue, and or had a draw with Deep Blue and then lost later. And what a kind of, we thought it was kind of fun. We didn't know at the time it was going to be something quite different coming down the line. So within narrow AI, there's also deep learning, right? Which is an approach that models the AI system on these neural pathways in the brain, right? And essentially, it somewhat is like AlphaGo, right? It takes its input, it learns from it and modifies based on its results. But it needs people. You need to say, what are the parameters for improvement? What are the parameters for success? Right? It's like with a little kid. You need to, okay, this is, if you play the sport this way, you've done a good job. You play the sport that way, you've done a bad job. If you go out of bounds here with the ball, you're penalty or not, or whatever. You see what I mean? So it needs people to somehow be involved with it, interact with it. And then there's the one that we are more moving towards, which is reinforcement learning, which is essentially a system which is autonomous and self-learning. It actually just generates its own data from the data that's presented to it, and can conduct its own experiments and develop meaningful questions from its own data, and draws its own conclusions and moves forward. I remember a very fascinating talk when I was doing my PhD at UCLA. I was in the geography department, which of course has human geography like geopolitics and things like that, but also physical geography like climatologists. So you got interesting talks from climatologists, and one of the climatology professors who was on his way out, he's retiring, he gave an interesting talk about the future of climate research, and he was actually really worried about it from a human perspective, because he said the AI systems have gotten so good that they were using at UCLA that you didn't actually need a researcher anymore. The AI would generate the research questions, test the hypotheses, just go through the data, and all you need to do is just provide the data. The human was actually irrelevant, and this actually really bothered him. From like, what's the future of academic research? That's always stayed in the back of my head. It's kind of like, maybe I'll stay more on the human side of things. But anyway, so that's something really was quite interesting talk. So that's a sort of reinforcement learning approach, and it barely needs people. Again, you just essentially would need people to input the data, and that's it, because AI will do it for you, and it'll run this quite rapidly. Anyway, so these are overview of narrow AI. General AI doesn't exist. This is the AI you see in the movies, like in the movie Her, right? Where the AI, the man falls in love with the AI. Joaquin Phoenix, right? Great movie, really good, cool aesthetic. Love the movie posters too, right? Good to see a movie use pink as a real dominant hue instead of these sort of brown and drab colors all the time. Anyway, that's separate. Another topic there. So these are like all human level tasks, quite indistinguishable from a person. It really doesn't even need sort of human input other than to be sure the electricity's on. This is the kind of thing that a lot of researchers don't believe will ever happen, and the most optimistic ones believe it'll be about 100 years before we would ever get there. So we're safe for now. Academic research careers are safe for a while. But anyway, this is something that doesn't exist, but this is often the AI that gets hyped up the most in the popular press. So as you know, AI itself is a big umbrella term for systems of algorithms that interact with each other. So for those of you who don't know, what are algorithms? They're essentially just these groups of instructions for computers to take input and come up with output. David Kay, the UN Special Rapporteur, former UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of expression, says here that it's code designed and written by humans carrying instructions to translate data into conclusion, informations, or outputs. Quite a simplistic way to look at it. And the big question for us with algorithms is that, who's developed them? Humans develop these algorithms. And it reflects geography, social and cultural practices, gender, and class, conscious and unconscious bias. There's been a fascinating research that shows that given a same computing task, coders from different parts of the world will actually code it differently. There is no sort of objective approach to resolving a computing issue. So even our code could look quite different and would reflect the geography. There's like, for example, a pattern of South American coding, believe it or not, which is quite interesting. There's a pattern of North American, but it's actually a pattern of Middle Eastern coding. And actually, there's actually a sub-pattern in Middle Eastern coding of coding that occurs in the Levant or in Palestine. So you can actually, like in the same way we have dialects of speaking, we have dialects of coding. But this is quite a newer area of research. But the point is, you can understand there from that how potentially problematic that can be. Then when you have somebody in San Francisco coding up a global platform like Facebook for the rest of the world, or you have a multi-billionaire in San Francisco buying essentially the global commons, as we've all heard about the news with Twitter, and thinking that this is how it should be. So essentially, what can these algorithms do? They're very easy stuff. AI is also quite simple. It classifies, predicts, identifies patterns and similarities, and can identify anomalies. That's essentially all that these algorithms are good at doing. Now, the extent to which our society is oriented around these things, that's a bigger question. and how much weight we give classification, which we do a lot, is a bigger question in terms of how much power algorithms actually have and AI has over our everyday life. But we've talked a little bit about some of the definitions, and if you have any questions, feel free to interrupt. This is not for me, so we don't have to wait until the end. But now I want to get into a little bit about AI online, now that we have a quick background. Social media platforms, your search engines, they all depend on AI to actually sift through enormous amounts of data and information. Imagine how many videos are being uploaded to YouTube every day, and how many tweets are being sent constantly, how much content is being uploaded to Instagram. Then you have all the interactions. In one Instagram session, you can like 50 photos, right? You can go right through. It's kind of hard to find ones you really liked when you're going back through it. But you can imagine, and times that by how many, hundreds of millions of people are using the platform. There's no realistic way that human beings could actually deal with this data, right? So AI is needed for these platforms to actually exist, and it's also needed in terms of from a perspective of trust and safety, right? There's just too much harmful content out there for humans to be able to sift through manually. So we need AI to also do quick and easy identification of content in order to send it either for the AI to moderate it itself or for the content to be sent to a human being to moderate later, right? And unfortunately, we also need AI to enforce copyright regulations. So when you upload a video on YouTube, which uses copyrighted music, the video will often be taken down quite quickly or automatically. In my internet and human rights class, we were talking about a new trend in authoritarian countries and in Western democracies of when police are arresting people, or committing police-based brutality or violence, they will actually play copyrighted music really loud so that anybody who films a video and then uploads it to YouTube will have an automatic takedown and the video can't go viral. That's a new tactic, right? Yeah, believe it or not, crazy. So that's an example of the power of AI taking it from offline into online. And this is a tactic that's actually originated in democracies in the United States and the UK, having police play this stuff when there's something happening. So anyway, so these AI does all these sorts of things on the platforms, and it's essential to their existence, but it's also essential to their business, to how they actually present data and information to you, and in terms of user safety. Whenever if there's a video of like we would see with ISIS quite a bit, a video of someone being beheaded, these algorithms got quite good at being able to detect a video that would look like that on YouTube, and then it would be sent to automatically recommended to a moderator. There's a good book that came out, I forget the author right now, called Behind the Screens recently, and there's a wonderful documentary that came out in 2018 called The Cleaners, which I show in my class, which talks about the AI pipeline, essentially, is that this content is identified as a beheading video, right? And then it's sent to mostly Filipino workers in large warehouses in the Philippines, who then go through the content and every day, 12 hours a day, are exposed to rapes, beheadings, murders, child pornography, and have to evaluate this stuff. And it's a lot of good work on the essentially outsourced trauma that these platforms outsource to these people who have to then bear the brunt of this. So that's also what AI is used for, is to take that offensive content, which it can sometimes self-moderate, but if it's unsure, it will have to go to human, and a lot of videos will go to human, which often have quite toxic repercussions for their mental health, and then for the health of the societies and the countries, of course, in which these individuals live. AI can act autonomously in this regard, where we had an interesting case with ISIS. ISIS flag is quite, it's kind of a lame flag, and it was easy to identify this in terms of videos. But then one of the problems you had actually was that ISIS stopped using the flags in the videos so that they would get their videos uploaded, right, and past YouTube censors. They figured this out pretty quick. But then Kurdish and other Syrian opposition forces would, take over an ISIS-held town or kill an ISIS unit and hold up a flag to show victory. And then YouTube was taking their videos down while leaving the actual ISIS videos up. So these are this is how AI can act autonomously, but not often in the best interest of the broader sort of social goals, which I'm 100% sure was not to promote ISIS, but rather to promote the other side. So, a couple of angles on human rights and AI. Now, AI has gotten a lot of human rights attention, and it's really, really focused on privacy and freedom of expression. How many of you have heard AI is a threat to our privacy, facial recognition, or AI is a threat to our freedom of expression through content moderation or things like that. It's really got quite a buzz. But me personally, as a human, one of the reasons I embarked on this sort of different research take, which we're going to get into in a moment, was because I, reflected on myself, and I realized like there's more to me than what I say and who's listening, right? That's an important part of life, an important part of being a human. But on the internet, in general, there's just more to being a human than just what am I saying and who's listening to me, which tends to be where a lot of the literature and the popular attention has gone, essentially boiling us down to these two sort of rights, which are important. Like careers and based on this is not denigrating it, but also there's other parts of being human, and I think we can start to look past that. So in terms of like quickly just to touch on these because these are really hot topics, of course, is to look at AI and impact on privacy. Can facilitate surveillance online quite easily, right? And when we talk about human rights class, most of my career has been focused against authoritarian regimes. And so one of the interesting tactics that a lot of authoritarian regimes have started to adopt, and if I talk too fast, by the way, let me know. I have a tendency to talk really fast. So if I'm, and you realize English is not a first or even the second language for many people, so you can ask me to slow down. I just heard myself for a second. So one of the things that AI can do, in addition to sort of regular surveillance, right, is it can actually be used to develop a profile of an individual. Let's say I want to target you in a specific way. I'm not going to, let's say I want to target you. So I might, develop an algorithm, develop an AI system that would actually then go and try to find all references to you, your academic articles, any photographs of you, any public stuff you have on your social media, past conference events that have been published, to build a dossier on you and then present it to intelligence agents so that I understand exactly how to target you. Then we can do a tonal analysis. Are your tweets confident? Are your tweets insecure? So what's your psychology in a way that we can perhaps target various emails to you in order to actually get you more likely to click on them and therefore compromising your computer and compromising your network. So this is something authoritarian countries actually already do, is use AI to develop profiles of groups, right? What's the group psychology? What's the group dynamic? What's an individual's sort of psychological breaking points, and so on. In addition to that, they use AI from this privacy aspect to go through your text messages that are unencrypted, right? Just standard SMSs, right? Quite easy to go through to get a sense of who you talk to, so on and so forth. Build out the network. I remember when I started this work back in the day. A lot of the AI systems weren't so good. So in many authoritarian countries that I worked against, you would actually have, people would have to go through the data and develop the network. Like who knows who knows where, how often do they talk, when do they meet, when are they online? It would have to be a manual thing. Now it can be online, just presented to the intelligence officers so that they can go forward and do their, really horrible work more efficiently. It can allow for really efficient and accurate facial recognition. If you're curious about this, read the New York Times articles on Clearview AI, which some of you may have heard about. It's an AI system that essentially developed in the United States and now used by law enforcement around the world, which allows me to take a picture of a random person and sync it with a massive and ever-growing database of open source intelligence photographs of people to identify almost anybody randomly around the world. That's got like 95% accuracy to accurately identify anybody it takes a picture of. It's over 3 billion photographs, at least that's what's been publicly released. So, in terms of the privacy aspect of things, it can facilitate efficient and accurate facial recognition. From the privacy perspective, we have taken a step back in terms of the data inputs, the data that's inputted into the machine learning system can have privacy issues. Right? Was it gathered ethically? Right? The whole Cambridge Analytica scandal. Is the data itself biased or not? If we think about how AI is used for, policing in Hungary, that information based on where police officers are going to patrol, the data that was informs that system was historical data that was input by the police. If we think about historical data in Hungary, what group might we think that Hungarian police disproportionately target or disproportionately believe are thieves or criminals? Roma, right? And so you can see the privacy issue right off the bat. So if they're patrolling there more, of course they're going to catch more crime. That goes into the system, and then they patrol there more. And other data has been gathered as well that we don't know about, because we often don't know the data inputs into the machine learning system, whether that's been gathered ethically or not. And the more recent trend is emotional predictive biometrics, right? Super interesting stuff. It's things where with a camera, they can kind of have a sense of how you feel, right? And so there's a lot of advertising programs that are coming up more recently, actually, that will automatically turn on your camera when you're like on, let's say, Wall Street Journal app or something like that, just a big one, or New York Times app, whatever. And it will like, analyze your face. And this stuff's already out there. It's not in wide distribution, but it's actually been developed in order to, analyze your subtle emotional cues and to deliver more relevant advertising to you based on exactly how you feel at the moment. This is coupled with, from the privacy perspective, like how many of you have like a smart home thermostat, like the Google Nest or things like that? These electronic thermostats. So Google owns the biggest home electronic smart home thermostat system. And one of the things that they've done is that thermostat system is then combined with you, because you have to use your Google account, with your Google account, with kind of searches you have, the kind of emails you send, where you go, on your phone, so on and so forth, where your Google Maps searches and things like that, to try to develop some sort of emotional, master picture of how you feel, who you are at certain times. So maybe in the morning you tend to look up, really happy music. So they might, to get your day started, or like, yeah, I'm gonna crush the day. Something like you wake up and you really need to get motivated for the day. So you might put on some like really bumping music, right? So they might then serve you ads more relevant to that. But maybe in the evening you lament over missed opportunities and you put up sad music or something like that, and then you might get ads more tailored for that. To give you an example, one aspect of this emotional predictive aspect of things, but then the biometric side is when the camera actually will be turned on you, and then without your permission or consent, or sometimes even with your permission or consent, when you register for the app, right? Not even at the moment, but when you sign up for the app, you give it permission to do that. So they kind of co-opt you and stopping it, that it will actually turn on the camera when you look at content. So that's privacy, really fun stuff, right? Anyway, so freedom of expression, of course. As we talked about, a lot of the content that's sent out for moderation is typically sent off to India or the Philippines, right? But do those individuals necessarily have the proper contextual understanding to know whether or not, a political cartoon in Turkey is satire or not, or what it might be referencing, right? Or the different standards of nudity, or different standards of sexual expression in different cultures in different countries, right? And these moderators, the human moderators, can actually, censor things that shouldn't be censored in that cultural context, or that don't make sense. And actually, these are the hidden hand that guides online free speech. And then the AI system, of course.
Sorry, can you remind me about the demonstration here? Do you need assistance with the equipment?
No.
No?
We're good. Just having a nice chat. Thank you. And the AI itself, as I hinted at earlier, developed under specific contexts, right, by specific people who have very specific backgrounds, doing specific things, who might not even be able to understand what kind of content should or shouldn't be flagged automatically. Does that make sense? And then from another freedom of expression perspective is, you go to your, how many of you use Instagram? Okay, awesome, good. And you use Instagram, and there's stuff like, have you ever noticed how sometimes there's an account you really like, but then it vanishes from your feed, and other random accounts you don't interact with so much come back? Like, actually, the other day I had it. I was just happened to find this one picture. I was like, yeah, I really like that guy. Like, why doesn't it show up again? So we actually don't understand how things are weighted, what's going on behind the scenes with the algorithm, right? It's really opaque. So this actually has an impact, naturally has an impact rather, on freedom of expression, right? In terms of what content is out there. And like, as I talk about in my classes, I believe an important part of freedom of expression is not just the act of saying it yourself, but you want other people to hear. Otherwise, we all just, what's the point of sharing anything, right? And so this kind of, what is promoted? Why is it promoted? How is it there? How is it ranked? How do I get shown certain things? And how does my, actions impact others is quite opaque. But this is the bulk of the literature. This is the bulk of the public conversation. We've been focused on these things. And as I said a little bit earlier, I started to, reflect on this because I would read this, like, okay, yet another privacy thing. I mean, it's not that it's not important, but at some point you hit kind of a saturation, especially if you, as you all know, within whatever fields you're in, you kind of hit a point where you're like, okay, I need new stuff. And I got interested in seeing, again, moving past what I say and who listens to me into focusing on a couple other rights. So I started a bigger research, sort of bigger arc that focuses on looking at different human rights and how AI interfaces with them. So far I've gotten through the assembly and association, and freedom of religion or belief. So that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit about these rights and then how AI impacts them. So we have a bit of a different take from the standard sort of stuff that we've actually been going through so far. So quite briefly, the rights to assembly and association, basically it's a right for us to do this, right? To hang out together, talk, join trade unions, agitate for change, hold people in power to account. So I'm just quite summarizing quite quickly here. And generally speaking, it's, how it can be restricted is only for aspects of national security, public health, and so on, but that are in accordance with democratic law, right? Why is this important? It's quite obvious. It's a cornerstone right for any sort of democratic deliberation, that we can come together, talk, understand what we want, how we want our society to be, how we want it to take shape, go onto the streets peacefully in March, come together and advocate for collective bargaining from a trade union perspective. Even not that, have artist collectives where we want to share art, and so on and so forth, right? And really acts as an insurance policy, this right for that. So how does it manifest offline, excuse me? As I said, peaceful protests, clubs and organizations, trade unions, collectives, petition signing, and so on. Very quickly, assembly and association, how it works and what it is. But online, excuse me, sorry, the slide was incorrect. Okay, well, I'm sorry about that. Anyway, assembly and association, how it manifests online. Whoops, we'll stay here and I'll just tell you about that. How it manifests online is it's like you have Facebook groups, you have online petitions like change.org. How many of you have ever signed an online petition? We have CEU students who've done a lot of online petitions over the years about things. That's an example of expressing assembly and association online, right? Joining a Facebook group, following a hashtag, right? How many of you have ever followed a hashtag with a specific event? I would follow some of the hashtags here during the protests, the anti-coronavirus protests in Vienna, because I want to see what's going on, because some of them were quite scary. If you got accidentally caught in them here, which happened to me a few times when I didn't know what was going on, and then you're like, oh, definitely want to keep an eye on this stuff before I go out. It's engaging in group conversations. It's a comment thread on a post on Facebook, right? That's an example of assembly and association, that we're coming together around a specific post, right? So these are different ways that assembly and association has manifested online. We'll now talk about freedom of religion or belief before we then go on into how AI impacts and works with them. Everybody on the same page so far? Cool, great. So freedom of religion or belief is a bit more complicated, right? And that's often even special rapporteurs at the UN say it's kind of more complicated, right? Assembly and association is a little bit more straightforward. So we'll go a little bit more in depth in this case, because I think it's actually a very fruitful area of research in general. The actual Article 18, says that everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes freedom to change religion or belief, freedom either alone in community with others and in public or private, to manifest religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance. So how it manifests, basically, right there is a teaching, practice, worship, and observance. Why is it important? As the UN Special Rapporteur Heiner Bielefeld said, combats discrimination, helps us combat negative stereotypes, helps minimize the harassment of minorities, persecution of dissidents, and so on. Manfred Noack actually believes that the freedom of religion or belief is the core of the ICCPR and the core of human rights. It essentially advocates for the idea that the individual is a rational being and master of his own destiny, his or her own destiny. Right. So that the core point of being human, from some scholars' perspective, is in freedom of religion or belief. And as Bielefeld says really quite beautifully, it's essential to developing any conception of life, of what life is. Why am I here? What's my purpose? What is this whole weird rock floating in space? Why do I do what I do? Why do I care about what I care about? These sort of really basic, fundamental human things, right? Why am I angry? Right? We have a lot of people angry in politics. Perhaps they should exercise this right a little bit more. Why am I angry? Why am I happy? These sort of fundamental things, right, which sort of in a way supersede career or capitalist stuff, that are essential to have a point of life. So there are two sides of freedom of religion and belief. There's what's called the forum internum and the forum externum. Forum internum is considered in human rights law to be inviolable. right? You cannot violate this. This is the fundamental, this right does not permit any limitations on freedom of thought, conscience, or the freedom to have or adopt a religion or belief of one's choice. Because it's fundamental, the idea that, and this is about having an internal sense of who I am and what I believe, that this cannot be, because that destroys the humanhood. If you don't have a sense of who you are, what you want, right, at that moment, your selfhood is kind of vacated, right? You can have other rights removed, but if you at least can retain the sense of I exist, that's very important. That's the core from which other rights derive, which is from the literature. So the form externum is the external manifestations of freedom of religion or belief, as we talked about, which we'll talk about, go a bit more in depth in a second. So there's some really quite interesting literature on the form internum and AI, which we'll get to in a moment. And I want to focus and talk a little bit now about some of these manifestations, worship, teaching, practice, and observance, and give you some examples of how they appear online. There's an important field of study called digital religion, and it helps us to look at how actually religion as a broad field, broad category, or belief actually occurs online. And this discipline is actually not in dialogue with human rights literature. So that was one of the things I was hoping to try to do in some of my work on freedom of religion and belief, is to bring these two in contact, because there's a disconnect. You look at any of the UN reports, UNHCR reports, academic literature on AI or freedom of religion. So one of the most interesting things that came up from the perspective of worship was within Buddhism, it's actually been considered like an online space can be sanctified as a sacred space, thereby generating the same religious merit as actually having been in person, right? And this is quite radical, where Buddhism is really in a way taken a lead in terms of adopting technology. And the Dalai Lama himself has actually held religiously, quote unquote, valid ceremonies online, where it's considered to have the same sort of merit as if you were there in person. That there is no separation in the physical space or online space in terms of what is considered to be sacred or holy ground. Right? So we can quite quickly see how the internet could be very important, for example, for somebody who's disabled, who's quite religious, or with a COVID situation, or might be quite poor and unable to make it to the ceremonies because of having to work a lot of different jobs, and so on. From the perspective of teaching, one of the most another interesting thing that's come up is Gray actually documented this extensive network, kind of under the radar network, of Muslim women-led courses that are run on Facebook, that are run on WhatsApp, in a way for women to have a space to actually connect with their Muslim faith, and to be taught by other women and connect and learn from other women. And that this was actually essential for many of these women, particularly in countries where it might be more difficult for women to go out and to go to mosques or to get religious education that they would actually want, or to even learn more about their own faith. And in Nepal with COVID-19, there's a small sect of Buddhists, the Newar Buddhists, who actually continue to teach and lecture in Sanskrit, right? The very ancient language of Buddhism, which they're the last sect to do it. So when COVID-19 happened, there was a real big concern that this would die out, because people weren't going to be doing Sanskrit, and nobody knew. As you all remember, when COVID happened, nobody knew how long this was going to last. I remember some of the predictions. People were saying like, "Oh, we'll be out of this in 5 years," and it was like, so you can understand the concern at the time. And then actually, because in Buddhism, online space would be considered sacred space, they could hold then also religiously valid teachings online in Sanskrit, which enabled Sanskrit to continue to be a language of instruction, as it has been for quite some time in Buddhist history, and also for the community to be able to get its religious teaching done. Okay, practice. In Indonesia, there's this One Day, One Use movement. It's over 124,000 members, and it's an entire worship group with 124,000 members that just I think it's over 4,000 individual WhatsApp groups rather, where they actually have all aspects of Islamic practice online. We can ask questions, connect with the sheikh, make all these sorts of different practices or questions together as a sort of a community. So essentially have a bigger ummah, if you want to think of it that way, within one community here, one geography. And there are also very interesting apps for Catholic Catholic prayer and Catholic confession, actually, so that you can do with on your iPhone in between doing other things. And then from the observance perspective, this was also very quite interesting to me to discover, is that there is oftentimes, women, I'm half Iranian, so I can understand this part. Women who might dress more in an Islamic style can face a lot of harassment, conscious, unconscious, certain glances, certain looks, people getting uncomfortable. I mean, talking about even the micro stuff, right? Not just the get out of here, we're going to ban the hijab or whatever, but even this sort of micro stuff, it can make the world feel like quite hostile to many people, and many conservative Jewish women as well. So there's a whole kind of networks of bloggers and like Instagram accounts and so on, where these women can actually share fashion tips and actually feel, as they report in the research, feel like that they're not freaks, that it's not weird, that there's other people like them, that they're not alone. So, okay, that's it. We've had a little bit of a human rights lesson. And how does AI impact these rights online? AI online essentially impacts all human rights in two really broad categories, right? We're not focusing on, like some of the stuff I talked about before, like the facial recognition, software surveillance, this stuff is maybe it's offline. We're talking about only on the internet here. So content moderation, which is essentially what exists on social media, right? What is actually moderated is there, or content display, which is actually what you see. Does that make sense? So if something is moderated, is when the moderator, AI or human or AI assisted human, will determine whether or not this post is there on Facebook. Right? Like with Trump, the content was, he was moderated out of Twitter. I mean, of course, I think he's going to be back now. Content display is how things are sorted with the AI algorithm. Why do I see this thing at the top of my feed? Why doesn't my research appear at the top of Google Scholar? Simple stuff like that, right? Very important question for academics. Why is my research not there? We actually don't have any idea. We don't know. So that's content display. So, I'm just addressing them each one in a quick slide, quite broadly here. So the first one is in content moderation. In terms of assembly and association, one of the ways that it can impact it is through removing posts or groups or promoting certain types of collective. I see Gabler's on the phone. I just noticed that. Removal of posts that might promote certain types of collective action, right? And this can be done automatically, right? This can be done with unconscious bias by AI developers. This can be done, by the moderators who don't know any better, who are assisted by AI, and so on. The lack of contextual understanding, which could promote certain content, which might emphasize authoritarian groups or anti-LGBTQI groups, which has happened quite a bit actually, where I think there was where the AI was trained was highlighting what are considered normal groups. So I think it was on Facebook actually, where very early on in Facebook, if you were searching for singles groups, it was always heterosexual singles that would come right up to the top because that was coded to be the normal, right? The training data used actually can, be biased against vulnerable individuals. For example, and maybe completely unintentional with the best of intentions, actually. So Google's natural language sorting actually had coded being Jewish as being a bad thing, right? Because of what had happened to Jews in the Holocaust. So that might have been quite, in order to do something nice and good, but it actually classified this whole group as being bad. And another thing with Google was also the fact that it's Google Images search. If you typed in monkey or gorilla, it would show Black people. And that was, so you can see what I'm talking about, the biases were encoded actually in the development. And in part, it's believed that came from the fact that only less than 2% of the people who work at Google's AI were actually Black. So you can't tell me that didn't impact the perceptions of what a normal face might be. So that's for the content moderation assembly association. So the training data that is inputted, the people who develop it may actually create unconscious bias, unaware bias, which might not promote or promote certain other types of groups or associations or causes or petitions or other sort of collective action or videos which might spark collective action, right? Consider the Arab Spring, how that really sparked up from videos that went viral in the beginning in Tunisia, right? Imagine if the algorithms have been perhaps biased against videos that might show that. We might not have had the Arab Spring, and maybe things would have been better or not. That's a separate question. But this sort of democratic moment would not necessarily have happened. Freedom of religion or belief. So with content moderation, the AI can actually explicitly remove content which might violate, be contrary to dominant norms. This is an AI ethics perspective. This is where ethics can be a bit problematic when it comes to AI, because it might be ethical to remove content that might get you killed. Like if you're a religious minority, it would be ethical, for example, for Hazara in Afghanistan to not have their content necessarily highlighted because they're a threatened group, right? But then is that fulfilling their rights? For example, or Shia in Afghanistan also come under attack. It actually, part of the problem with content moderation is that it can actually completely remove the ability to practice and exercise that right, rather than content display which hides it, right? So in terms of like if a certain religious perspective is, let's say, filtered out, let's say Jehovah's Witness, right, which you often see actually quite a bit in Vienna, which has been interesting because I've only seen them in the United States before, and that content gets moderated out because it's viewed as being whatever the definition might be, then you don't even have a chance to engage with that. Or atheists, for example, in Iran, right, where atheism is illegal, right? If that content gets moderated out, you don't even have a chance to engage with the idea of atheism online or find it, or you have a community in which to work through that. Or if you're another type of religious minority, right? If you're Jewish in Iran. And training data, as we hinted at earlier, was talked about the Roma, could actually result in over-policing of religious minority, the over-surveillance of religious minorities. So content display is what we'll talk about next. Assembly and association. And quite interesting with content display, again, this is how things are sorted and how they're showing up. And it's to me, it's very interesting because we use these algorithms to develop a personalized feed. I didn't want to see Donald Trump on Twitter, right? So the algorithm eventually would learn to not even show me stuff that people had liked his tweets that I might follow. I'd be interested in following, for example, some people might have different perspectives. And they might like Trump, and they'll say, "Oh, this person liked that." You know what I'm talking about. But this excessive personalization can therefore actually, through display, actually limit your exposure to diverse groups and other different opinions. Right. Consider what might happen to trade union posts, right, under Elon Musk now at Twitter, who's very anti-trade union. Those posts might mysteriously now, collective action posts might mysteriously not come up as a recommended post or one that's seen very often. So you can see the danger right there, right? If something that sits against things, or we might, Amazon is quite anti-union. I'm not saying this happens, but it's potential, searching for trade union books on Amazon or how to form a union, you might get a lot of weird results that might kind of disrupt your search, right? Because one of the ways, at least from an authoritarian perspective, is you can game the system when it comes to algorithmic manipulation, is if you just make it too hard to search for something. This is a tactic that happens in like China. You just make it too difficult to find something. You can't block something, just make it too hard, people give up. Right? You work on their psychology. So the type of content shown, Susie Allegre has just published a recent book on this topic, and there's a growing body of literature about the impact of AI on the form in turn, on how you form opinion itself, how you form a sense of self itself, right? If these algorithms are micro-targeting you based on everything you've ever liked, I still remember one of my students, I have this assignment where I have students download their personal data from Facebook and then take a look at it and actually go through it. So this one guy came in one year. He was head was in his hand. He was completely white, pale, and he was like, "It's 8 gigabytes. I had no idea." He was just completely shocked. And they had tracked everything he had done ever since he was a teenager until now. Every interaction. He had Facebook on everything. And as you all know, Facebook doesn't just track what you do on Facebook, right? Whenever you have those buttons, they share on Facebook, share on social media. That actually reports what you do back to your Facebook account if it's on your phone or if you're logged in on your laptop or desktop, right? So Facebook extends its reach outside of the platform so it can develop a full sense of actually who you are. So with that micro-targeting that happens with tracking and with the unusual ability of AI to actually sort through, as I showed you earlier, and identify patterns that even researchers may not know. AI can actually identify things about you don't even know you like. And that was some of the interesting things my students have found too. They're like, I didn't even know I actually go to this like I actually look this stuff up all the time. Or one person was like, I guess I'm kind of not over my ex because I didn't know. I realized how much I searched for them. Fascinating insights, right? But the point is from this perspective, the type of content that's shown and manifests and emerges influences how you think, what you see, the opinions you generate about the world, right? We all know that. How many of you have woken up, read the news, had to turn on social media, seen the first thing that came up and been like, oh man, get in a bad mood, or get in a good mood. So it can actually, and that doesn't go away, right? Somehow resides within you. And so content display can actually therefore influence even how you form your sense of self, how you form your opinion of the world. I did an informal study many years ago with people who had grown up under internet censorship. Surveillance, we talked about this in my class, where the people had learned to not do certain searches online. This is a bit outside of AI, but to illustrate the context. And talking with them in the Netherlands, they had since left, and they said, I just don't ask questions anymore. I just learned that it was too risky to search for what I was interested in, whether it was being gay, looking for a divorce, for some women who had domestic abuse, being gay, being an atheist. They stopped asking questions. And so we can understand like how, especially for younger people, perhaps many of us are a little bit more set in our opinions, or for a younger person that all they've seen is this sort of curated, managed content. How does a sense of self, what happens? So we don't know. So from the religion and belief perspective, that's considered to be, a very core part of building a stable, deliberative, pluralistic, which is a word that comes up often in the literature with this right, society. As then exactly as I say there too, and it may deprioritize content needed for individuals to develop a conception of life. So if we understand that AI is a necessity on social media platforms, that we have to sort through the information that's out there in order, Facebook can't just put everything there at once. Your computer and your phone couldn't load it, just explode. If we understand that it has to be some sort of AI, there has to be some sort of censorship and moderation, right? This is something that the rights community, and working with Wikimedia and seeing on how it works on the big tech on the inside. The rights-based community doesn't actually understand, like there is going to be an element of this. These platforms just will not function. But that content, how it's prioritized, actually, separate from the content that's shown, what is prioritized can also then influence, how you develop this conception of life, right? Which content is prioritized more. And finally, recommendations of targeted advertising can, reinforce dominant religious narratives, right? You might see advertising, for example, if you're homosexual, you might see advertising that will, reinforce the heterosexual norm, right, or norm of couplehood and so on, or the norm of having children. With this targeted advertising, one of the most interesting things from content display perspective that came up in my research, and I published on this on my paper on violence against women in Pakistan. Was in Pakistan, there's women will hold two Facebook accounts, two social media accounts, two Facebook accounts for this story here. And they'll have one that's sort of the real one, where they're with their friends, they're hanging out with, unmarried men, so on and so forth. And then they have the more morally correct one, the more publicly correct one, that will show them, as being pious or being covered in hijab and, staying at home or doing very, womanly things and, those sorts of things. And many of the women have even learned to adapt the behavior on each of the accounts because they know that the algorithm might inadvertently recommend them to somebody else. So if you're on your conservative account and you search for, a certain person or friend, and you're on your real account and you search for a certain person that's a friend on your conservative account, you might come up on the recommendation and they're going to be like, wait a minute, and that could cost you your life or acid thrown in your face or so on. So there's even this knowledge of how algorithms can actually, based on how religion or belief manifests online, can impact the recommendations, can even impact the health, the literal safety of people, specifically in countries where there might be issues like I'm talking about with Pakistan when it comes to women's rights. Okay, we've talked a lot about this. So I think this is the final slide or second to last slide. So we're almost in the home stretch here. So just some possible remedies that I think are worthwhile to consider. And there's no easy answer here. The first is I really think that there needs to be greater transparency with our algorithms. And this is something that the Digital Services Act, which was just passed in the EU, you might have heard just I think within the past couple of days, is possibly going to address, right? At least it's supposed to address, but we'll see how it actually happens, is that we actually don't know how these algorithms work. We can't actually catch, see what the biases are that may have slipped in. We can't see what the, heterosexual white dude in San Francisco makes $1 million a year. And that's the salaries that they make, by the way. Who makes $1 million a year. We actually might not be able to catch his biases in there, right? Because we don't know the code. It's just in there, and it's reviewed by peers within the company because it's intellectual property. That you can imagine the groupthink that can happen from something like that, right? Imagine if I had let's say if I had a bunch of friends who were from Los Angeles, 40, how old am I? 41 year old, half Iranian, half American guys all hang around and review something. We might come to some differences, sure, but they might be, remarkably similar stuff, also given socioeconomic bands and so on. So having more transparency with their algorithms in a way, the intellectual property is a separate question of serious issues with even the idea of intellectual property, but given the current way things are, having protections in companies for their intellectual property so that these algorithms can be reviewed externally by academic experts, ideally, or well-respected industry experts is a first step so that we can understand exactly what's happening there. In terms of diversity, I think that if states can incentivize, having hiring diverse candidates for AI development and deployment, it might help address, for example, only 2% of Google's AI workforce was Black. Is it any surprise then that maybe perhaps just Black people weren't coded in a way that they would be people, not animals? Because the algorithm would just look for a certain color and certain shape and say that this is a gorilla or monkey. But I doubt that would have happened if you had more Black representation there, for example. Or, as we've seen in Austrian hiring practices here and Austrian benefits practices here with AI, if you had perhaps more Muslims there, you might actually, have a more equitable distribution of resources. The worst name to have, by the way, for being hired is Muhammad, and that's in Europe or the United States, because AI will go through. That's actually the worst name to have. So, yeah, if you have that name, at least change it, get it, apply for a job, and then change it back after you get it. So if we can encourage diversity and also have multiple viewpoints that are out there, I think it's quite valuable. Now, a lot of companies do human rights impact assessments. We're doing one at the Wikimedia Foundation for that. What is the bigger impacts of Wikimedia around the world in terms of human rights? There's a lot of serious human rights issues. Wikimedia is the standard for global information. It's a source, of essentially most open source information that people get out there for journalists. Lots of researchers use it. When you type in what is, Liechtenstein, you'll look at the little info box and get a 2-second summary. These are really important. And a lot of governments are actively interested in arresting users. Many Wikimedians have been arrested actually as a result of the war in Ukraine by Belarusian and Russian authorities and so on. So we're conducting a human rights impact assessment. But from the AI perspective, right, just a human rights impact assessment doesn't get to the specifics of AI. And this is one of the problems that we've seen with human rights impact assessments for AI, is it tends to take the high level and not get into actually the nitty gritty of how is AI, how was the data collected? When was the data collected? Who did the collecting? Right? Who did the collecting? Just use the Roma policing example, which is a famous one in Hungary and also in the United States with Black neighborhoods. If you had policing data from the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, right, far more overtly racist times, right, and you had cops who were just then disproportionately patrolling Roma or Black neighborhoods. If you have more cops there, of course you're going to see more crime there. That's just the nature. If I hang out here, if I'm looking for students, I'm just sitting in the classroom all day, I'm more likely to see students just in one classroom all day than if I go to Spar or Villa, right? So we have this, and then that data gets inputted, data gets collected, gathered, inputs, and then influences for things in the future. So asking these kind of questions with the human rights impact assessment, rather than just sort of doing human rights washing and doing an HRIA and then just piecing out, but having something more specific and unique. The states also should consider legislation to promote competition in AI development and to ensure that other smaller actors can enter the space. AI's development and deployment is almost dominated by the big five, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook, and Apple. Right? These just dominate the field. We need to get smaller actors in there. It would be great to have people, more diverse groups developing AI systems, right? Not just these. And if we can at least move the center out of San Francisco, that might be helpful, or out of, Microsoft's in Seattle, and Amazon in Seattle, right? So at least out of the west coast of the United States, let's have somewhere else. So foster competition, and then really something I really believe in is fostering a culture of human rights, right? Human rights is just a radical idea that another person actually exists, and that they exist with all their wants, needs, desires, complications, and so on, right? It's actually quite a radical idea. It's very difficult for us to accept other people exist oftentimes, actually exist, actually have their own wants and needs, and might disagree with us, right? Part of the struggle that we've seen around the refugee situations that we've had is the shock that other people exist and may have wants and may actually resent wealth or say, hey, why are you hoarding all this money? What are you doing with it? So on and so forth. It's quite challenging. So creating a culture of organizations where we try to consider, that humans actually exist, and how can we sort of, front load that in every step of the pathway, right? As we're developing AI or deploying AI, not just from the developers, because that also puts the onus there, but okay, what about the rest of the organization? Like these cultures, these organizations which have like quite biased AI or AI that might be discriminatory, whether it's intentionally or unintentionally, it's not in isolation. Not just the developers who are unaware. They're hanging out with other people. They're hanging out with people in finance and human resources and advertising. How do you get the organization to start to think a little more about human rights? How can we promote that? So this is something I think organizations should do. Is to start getting people to think a little bit, be a little more thoughtful, try to deal with the fact that other people actually exist, and they might not look like you or even agree with you. And I think that's it. Whew. All right. Sorry, I talked at you for so long. So there we go. Thank you. Any questions, comments, concerns?
Thank you. So we are opening the floor, and we see the people here, so you can actually invite them. But whoever wants also online to ask a question, just since we cannot see you, just turn on your microphone and go ahead. Okay? We cannot see your hands, that's why.
Yeah.
I have a question about so many of these companies are private, right?
Yeah.
But we want to treat this kind of things, they were in the public sphere. So then seems to be a conflict between property rights and the kind of public procurement we want to have. So I was thinking in terms, for instance, of freedom of assembly and things. That's something that governments are supposed to provide, but freedom of assembly is restricted to the public sphere. Like you cannot have a meeting in my flat. And I guess that's a kind of response that these companies will say, right? So just meet with your friends, but not in my algorithm or whatever. So that would require really a change of thinking how these virtual spaces work.
Yeah. I mean, I think that we are seeing that happen. Facebook, all the big tech companies have a human rights team. Who knows how long Twitter will have it now, unfortunately. But and I think that exactly it's more of a voluntary thing, and we can encourage them to follow the UN's business and human rights standards. And it seems like a lot of companies are, because first of all, civil society backlash has been really effective. Think about how dramatically the idea of privacy has changed in the past 3 or 4 years, which was nobody was thinking about it, and now a lot of us think about privacy. That's been through the efforts of civil society organizations really pushing that. So I do think that as the culture changes, we're going to see hopefully more adoption. But like you said, companies, Twitter could just say, which Elon Musk has actually hinted at when he started. I think yesterday he started to attack one of the chief diversity officers or equity officer, something like that, on Twitter. We could see him just say tough luck, but it depends on goodwill. And also, thankfully, civil society has been quite effective. So ensuring civil societies, donate to the EFF and other organizations, But yeah, it's up to them entirely to do that or not. But companies like Microsoft, I know for sure, Facebook, they take human rights very seriously. They have very serious teams there that work on that stuff. So.
Yeah, I would like, so first, thanks for your talk. And then I would like to hear more about your thoughts on the Digital Services Act. So do you think this is going to work? I mean, is transparency enough if you have kind of algorithms and artificial intelligence processes behind it that are just so complicated? So how could you ever imagine that, having another pop-up banner I agreed to,
Yeah.
and then kind of 100 pages of algorithm, or what? How could this work?
So that's it's a good comment. So my understanding of the DSA, and I haven't really gotten really super into the details of it yet, but my understanding from what I have read is that the algorithmic transparency is going to be focused on like essentially putting these algorithms into the hands of expert working groups who can then take a look at it and then be able to provide a sort of outside expert or more detached judgment. But like exactly what you're getting at, which is one of the critiques of the idea of transparency. And I think I don't think there's better ideas. I think this is unfortunately where we are with it. But one of the critiques is even if you have maximum transparency of the algorithm, you still cannot oftentimes accurately predict the output of the algorithm because it can be enormously complex. There's an enormous amount of variables that are out there. So you actually, even if we open it up to everybody, we might not be able to predict anything, right? We might be able to get a few things, sure. But I think that and I don't know if they're going to do pop-ups or anything like that, but it's just that as I see it, I don't see any other choice right now. This is all work in progress. This is all an experiment rather than the final thing. Like I view law to be more of a, we're trying things out rather than this is the law. And so we'll try this out. The DSA, we'll try it out. We'll see how does transparency work? Is it effective? Does it work? And then hopefully we can keep it, collectively creative and open mind and amend the laws or change it if we see if it works or it doesn't work. But nobody's tried yet this idea of like, let's open up algorithms for external at major companies for external review and then kind of report back and see what happens. So I think it's worth trying. We'll have to see. I think I was really glad to see that because I've been hoping for that for years, for at least to give it a shot, see can it work, and then I don't know how the reports would be structured or how public they would be because there's a lot of intellectual property issues and so on, and even whether or not it'll make a difference, but at least something. Because we also just can't trust a group of 30 engineers in San Francisco that they know everything, who had, they have their own background. So who knows?
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Joel?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, thanks a lot for this fascinating talk. To what extent the policies of these companies are in the focus of competition? Are there examples when a company would try to have an edge in market competition by criticizing the algorithms of the other company, making the point that that their way of policing or their way of considering complaints or whatever is more democratic, more humane, or in any way better than the others? Is there a website where I can go where I could have a comparative picture about the alternatives in this regard?
No, the closest might be what's called ranking digital rights, which essentially looks at how different companies. It was actually part of it was housed at CEU, actually at the Center for Media, Democracy and Society at CMDS back a while. Ranking digital rights, they do look at how companies talk about rights and actually what they do. And companies do call out other companies with regards to their algorithmic processes. Twitter was really at the forefront of this, right with everything that happened in the United States with the contested presidential election and Trump's. And they were really out there saying like, we're taking steps, and like YouTube was lagging, Facebook was lagging on it, and they really called them out. So there is that sort of inter company sort of competition around that. It was, and Apple has a really good reputation for privacy, in part because it really criticized Google and went at them for their sort of creepiness in advertising and AI. But to my knowledge, ranking digital rights is probably the best place to get at least some sense of how companies are going through, and it provides an index and ranks companies based on their approaches to rights. Yeah, but we I think that the purchase of Twitter by Elon Musk is going to be a tectonic shift, particularly if he goes forward with what he's at least talked about now. Whether or not that's the case, we'll wait to see, because he's essentially proposing having free speech to the limit of the law in every country, which, as you know, that's not exactly how free speech should work. And of course, many countries have different definitions of free speech. So how that might change the landscape, because Twitter was at the forefront of really being on top of its algorithm and trying to be transparent and open about some stuff. And Musk has talked about opening up part of it, but he's also talked about taking it in a quite dangerous direction in terms of taking off any of the sort of guardrails that are there. So we'll see how this shifts with that, if that purchase goes through. I think it could be quite dramatic. I know many people in the human rights community, to the extent that I've talked with them over the past few days, in tech are broadly worried, because if Musk does this, if he starts to say, we're not going to care about what our AI does, tough luck, this is deal with it, that sort of American freedom crap, that other executives might also feel the same way about their algorithms now, in order to compete, because they don't want to lose users to Twitter, for instance. So we're at a very interesting moment. At the same time, we have the DSA coming, really some great stuff coming out of Europe, and then we might just have a really tectonic shift that nobody could have seen just 6 days ago.
Thank you. Yeah.
All right. So first of all, thanks. Like, this is fascinating. I know nothing about the topic, so it was really cool to get some ideas out of this. But I do have a question. When you,
Interesting stuff, right? It's kind of like, yeah, it's cool.
Yeah, it's really cool. I really like it. Anyway, but I was wondering about this whole but this Musk thing has been in the news, etc. And in a way, there was after Twitter banned Trump, etc. And all of this happened, but this sent shockwaves through the conservative community, also in Brazil. I'm Brazilian, so I saw it. It was very like a big blowout out of this, and then they created a different, separate, very niche social network. I don't remember the name.
Truth Social, whatever.
Yeah, something like that. Some crap like that, where basically the idea was, well, we were going to have freedom of speech up until the limit of the law, and the law was the U.S. law, which Yeah. So my question is that not only after the buy, but I think that there is a backlash towards what Twitter did. So like there's a big response to what Twitter was doing, and then doesn't that call for more government intervention? Because I'm sorry, but like in the end, it seems to me that there's been a kind of a race to the bottom in terms of this self-regulation, and then this calls for more regulation out of external bodies. And how can this work? And also, like, if you were, if I understood correctly, you work closely with the UN, like, or something like this, like you cited the UN a bunch of times, and like, I know that the UN doesn't have any binding, but it like recommended resolutions, these kinds of things, if they're working on it or something like that.
The first question, about government regulation, I think you've got an issue because a lot of the platforms, what they essentially say is that they are a platform. They provide a platform for individuals to provide content. They don't do anything, right? It's like if you couldn't sue whoever owns, like, I don't know if CU owns this building. I think we're renting it, right? So whoever owns this building, if we started talking about, like, let's say killing all the people named Cameron, okay, just to keep it centered on me, and I'm the only person I know by name the way it's spelled, so it seems very safer. So killing everybody named Cameron, but you can't sue the building owner for that, and that's essentially the argument that the platforms have. Like, hey, we're just the building owner. You all making the content. You're the issue. But that's the problem. Is the platforms have so far successfully argued against actually being considered liable for what users publish on their platforms, and that's going to be the biggest issue to get over. If you're going to have government regulation, just proving that Twitter is responsible for what the users post there, and I think it's going to be quite hard to get. From in the U.S. law perspective, I think it'd be quite difficult to convince anybody. I think it might get. The only way it can be is if it gets to the extent of it doesn't matter, we've got to do it. And who knows, we might, like you said, it's a race to the bottom, we might get there. Yeah. We could get there. So what was the second question? Sorry.
Oh no, like a more international approach to that. Like
I think the UN is really over the past year, I gotta be honest with you, the amount of like outreach I've had from the UN and seen also in terms of their external outreach and what they're doing has really accelerated. I think they're catching up to the fact that this is, a salient issue. And as much as hunger and refugee crisis are actually quite deeply important, this issue seems to grab a lot of people where the money is and where the power is. And I think the UN has really switched to really putting a lot of recommendations, really good stuff to try to get some frameworks out there, so hopefully more thoughtful companies and organizations and civil society can embrace them and take them forward and push them down the pipeline. And so I think the UN plays continues to play an extremely important role. It would be great if other, like the OSCE would get more involved, which is trying to do, but it's been a little bit, patchworky, and the EU to, also to continue its really sort of trailblazing stuff, and also to not stay just within the EU bubble, but also to start to work with other, regional and international organizations and alliances and so on to actually, make this more of a global push, like the push to have a global minimum tax. Also, some global minimum standards on these platforms, I think would be really good. Hopefully, we'll get there. The good thing is, because EU is such a heavyweight, right? When it does, like now everywhere around the world, you have this little cookies pop up that we have because of GDPR, right? Even in the United States, you have it now because we're not. It's like when California develops emission standards, it ends up because it's like the biggest vehicle market, one of the biggest vehicle markets on Earth. It ends up spreading around the world and certainly around the United States. So the EU continues on this way. That actually might, by default, force some changes in the platforms. So keep advocating here.
Thank you. Any other comments? Also online, we cannot see your hands, so feel free to just jump in.
Yeah. Good to see you, Gabor.
Good. He doesn't seem to hear us. I do have some questions.
Sure.
So I was wondering, related to discussion about DSI, that it's a European regulation, so it will apply only to consumers from EU, right? Do you think there will be spillovers, which will then work also in US or in other countries, or do you think that we will have regulations which are pretty local, and therefore platforms respond to these regulations and think whatever they were doing before?
It's a good question. So I think the EU is the sort of heart of policy entrepreneurship around this area, and I think that's great. I hope, as I was saying, I think that there will be some spillover, at least at minimum spillover, for having a framework to now start to think about things, whether or not it's actually there. But the way the big tech platforms have responded is often the divide and conquer, segmented sort of colonialist approach, right, to keep everybody distracted and things like that. So my concern is that with this, because this is different than GDPR, this is like we have to hand over our algorithms. You might even have you might have algorithms developed that focus on the EU market that are safe to hand over, while the rest of the world still gets the sort of crappy, creepy stuff. Because I think these companies also, just my sense of it is they're getting tired of being told what to do a little bit. We've seen this was some really good articles talking about the tonal shifts in Facebook's rhetoric, how it's become more aggressive and combative, and also how other tech platforms have become more aggressive and combative, indicating that they might be tired of this. And so it could be this just becomes an EU only thing. And that's my concern, and based on where it goes. But I think it's given at least policy entrepreneurs around the world some inspiration on how to think more creatively about things.
Isn't one of the big problems that politicians just don't know enough to handle these kinds of issues? I mean, the EU has really tried now over years to build up expertise on the topics, but I mean, they still need to have national politicians being involved, and they probably don't have any idea about it. Yeah, but so I wonder what you think. I mean, could you kind of build up mindsets, at least among the politicians of other countries, lobby for that? But how could you ever get ahead of these big companies? Because it seems like the expertise of the politicians and of behind the politicians is always one step or more steps behind the development.
Yeah, I think that's a really really big question, and I think that the first thing is these algorithms work really well, right? And that's part of the issue. Is that, victory is defeated in the efforts to actually address them. Because I get great book recommendations from Amazon. I'm not kidding. I don't use Spotify, but people who do, they love it. They get cool. Every time I listen to Spotify, I'm like, that's good music. How'd you find that? And I'm so old school about I prefer the radio person telling me. I don't know. I always like having a human involved. But anyway, my point is these algorithms work really well. You get some cool targeted ads sometimes, right? I certainly do. Or you think, oh wow, that's an interesting event that Facebook has recommended for me. Oh yeah, I do know that person. Oh cool, thank you for the recommendation. How have you been? They work really well. And when you have something that works really well, for the majority of people, they don't care. I mean, that's it. Hey, I want to get my books easier. I want to find books. I miss going to the bookstore and browsing, and I get the similar experience to great recommendation on Amazon. That's a win. So the bigger question is how do you get more people, again, that talked about earlier, to actually care that other people exist? And so I think part of the thing, I think it has to be some changes to the education system. I know everybody goes education, but I do think, we need to have some education about algorithms as part of the new public sphere. The same way we would have it. I grew up, having education about how does journalism play a role? What's its role in democracy and civics? That kind of stuff. But what is algorithms' roles now? We can add an extra session or two to class. So because there has to be it has to come in a way, not only from the top down, from the politicians getting expertise, but also regular individuals getting expertise and being able to understand this stuff. Maybe some of the stuff I talked about here, you didn't even know. About how algorithms work or what they can or cannot do, how they can be used to target people around the world. So I think there's an educational component. And then for the politicians, I don't think politics isn't supposed to compete with business. And I think that's where we get confused. We think how can politics keep up with business? But that's not the role of politics to keep up with business. It is supposed to be a slower, more deliberate thing because it's supposed to be democracy, ideally, where we're supposed to take some time to figure it out. So part of the solution to that, I think, is a more robust civil society that can act quicker and be more nimble, and then provide, and greater connectivity with politicians and government. Because there's, as I've experienced it, at least in Europe, there's the politicians, and there's the experts, and there's civil society, and the politicians go to the experts, and a lot of them ignore civil society because they don't. The reports kind of go on to nowhere. So building a greater bridge between all three of them. And often a lot of academics don't engage with civil society. You'll see civil society publish a report, and that somebody wrote a paper on that 2 years ago, and that they got no attention. But now, and then the civil society people aren't aware, and then the academic researchers already moved on to the next project and isn't aware of that. And so you kind of have all this stuff. So I think one thing that CU does well is try to bridge these things, and I think that's more effective. Many of my students have gone out to really good positions in the policy world around AI and technology and human rights, I think in part because of the kind of environment CU has fostered. And they're able to bring civil society, academic expertise to political offices actually around the EU. So I think CU is actually kind of a good model. I'm not trying to push CU for the prospective students, but I really do believe that it's a good, not perfect, but a good model for exactly how do we start to get a broader base of expertise, and not just in the politicians or the academics or civil society, but together. At least it's something to try. There's no one answer. Right now with AI, so we're just trying stuff.
But it sounds like a bit of making the issue more salient would help, right? So I think that's
education.
I mean, everything that you said, to me, of course, it might be my researcher bias here, but it brought to mind this word, making the issue salient, so civil society will have more voice, politicians will listen more, and also companies will be a bit more afraid to combat regulation, right? So,
and exactly approaching it from the reality of that most people aren't going to care. Yeah. There's this naivete that politicians, academics, civil society always have, but we need to get people to care. Most people aren't going to care. That's just, you have to take it off the table. But you can increase some general broad awareness. We all have a vague idea of privacy now. That is at least what we can also aim for, to make it a little bit more salient, a little bit more. Just enough people are hey, what do you do? Because you see these questions. Now, people they ask, the kind of quote unquote elementary questions. They say, what about my privacy? Huge question. Well, privacy for what? Well, you can go do a PhD on this. What is my privacy? But even the fact that people are asking that question, that's the salience exactly, I think. And we are not there. Every year, the amount of students who are shocked about what data Facebook has on them blows my mind. But they know what dude died at what bridge to save the fatherland in what year. Cool story, but can we broaden and make it more salient? I agree 100%.
Yes, think that's super interesting, the whole discussion. So I was wondering, there seems to be that there are so many problems that need to be solved, and it seems to be that those problems will open or probably have already opened so many job opportunities. And you have been in contact like with the industry, with business, with politicians, or what are the skills that are in demand for those different sectors?
That's a really good question. I in terms of the students that I've seen who have been really, really successful, you have to be very curious, because this is a whole new field, which means by the time you know something, it's already on the edge of being outdated. In the span of writing a paper, like having to be like, oh wow, there's all new stuff that comes, and I mean that's normal in every field, but with technology-based stuff, I mean it's like, oh, you've got to replace like half of things. I think being super curious. I know it's not something that we talk about a lot in academia, but I believe that intuition is extremely important, because since this is such a new and emerging field, we don't have clear ways mapped out yet. So it relies a lot of sort of intuitive judgment to be able to be like, I feel like this is a kind of a direction we should go. You can't just not like just think schools or approaches. So I would say like curiosity and intuition. And I think that in the tech human rights broad field, there's a lot of people want to get in on it. It's really sexy field. You can make a big impact right now, and so I think there has to be a level of that sort of entrepreneurship and taking chances. Like one of my favorite former students would hustle like crazy, and did not stop with any rejection, but believe that they had something to contribute to this, the broader conversation, and actually ended up getting very, very prestigious position, very near the top in their country, because they had a real sense of this is important, and I'm going to stay committed to it, and learn from my mistakes and not and grow and bring that sense forward, which the field needs. So, yeah.
So I'm asking because I'm teaching this social media class, and students very often are kind of wondering, when we're reading all these texts with a lot of statistics, like big data and so on and so forth, they kind of get the impression that this is the only path. You have to know programming, you have to know like quant. I'm just wondering what exactly is looked for. Is it? And I'm glad that you're talking about this other skills that you develop along your studies. But if you pick different classes, which classes do you pick? Do you pick like how do you do a case study, like qualitative methods? Is this in demand? For example, what have you heard, or what is there?
Yeah, I think if you have
also important for us, what do we teach, right?
Yeah.
What do we emphasize?
That's true. I think actually having a background in if you have some technical background, I think that can make a difference. Or not that with tech, it's really nice because you don't need to have a background; you can be self-taught. So you don't need to, in a way, waste time with classes unless you really want to. You can learn on your own. So I think having some sense of how some of the technology works, at least to a certain degree, really matters. But that depends on the field. Like in my experience, like being able to do qualitative work is really, really important. And I think is often lacking, because you see there'll be a certain technological problem like around human rights or something like that. And what we need is somebody who can be able to break down what are the potential flaws or areas where our approach is not working well, or their approach is not working well, and that's really in demand. Being able to bring a real critical eye, in terms of understanding methodology, qualitative methodology, and so on. I would say that that's really quite important. Having a good sense of technical background, having that more technical background is going to, depending on how much you have of it, it could slot you into a different career path that you might not want. So having some familiarity, I think, is important. If they're interested in like more policy side of things, qualitative.
Mm-hmm.
So they don't end up becoming like AI programmers by accident. Like, how did I get here?
And I guess related to this, what is your research? How do you do your research? Do you go on the field and talk to people? You said you have a paper on violence in Pakistan,
online violence,
online violence or gender violence in Pakistan. Do you talk to these people, or what kind of? I mean, I don't want to say methods, but what is your approach to do your research?
Yeah.
Because it's a very complex topic. It's like thousands of things. So how do you narrow it down, and what do you exactly do?
Yeah, I mean, for that paper, for example, my co-author and I, they conducted, because they could speak Urdu, conducted interviews with people, and did the relevant literature research over there. But generally speaking, it's talking with experts for me. People are in the field. I enjoy looking through what the UN has to, a lot of UN literature and case law in particular when it comes to human rights. I think it's quite influential, impactful. But also, one thing that I know is not super popular with academics, but a lot of the narrative that's set and the policies that are set right now in this world come from popular media. And actually looking through how is the popular media talking about it. I think the Royal Society actually had a paper that talked about AI narratives that are out in the dominant sphere. So, I take a more of a broad-based approach in terms of literature reviews and also speaking with experts. And so to that extent, networking for students is really, really important to be able to get to meet the people. And a lot of these organizations are quite hungry to have students come and learn from them. So,
Thank you. Let's check. Any other questions from the audience or from online? I don't know whether they can hear us. Okay. Well, it doesn't seem to be the case. So on this note, we're going to end the session. And thank you again so much for fascinating presentation and talk.
Well, thanks for having me. Thank you, everybody.
And we all have